Pale stone lies under the sun, already warm, and the air above it is dry enough that fine dust settles lightly on sandals, on hands, on the hems of cloth, and then rises again with each passing step. At Giza in the Old Kingdom, especially in the years of the Fourth Dynasty, the ground itself can be understood before anything larger is named. It is a broad plateau of brightness and chalky color, with worn tracks crossing open space, with edges of cut stone, with places where feet return again and again until a route becomes familiar simply by use. Dust and sunlight meet on every surface. The day is shaped first by ground underfoot. Here the great building is not separate from the rest of the place. It stands within a wider field of work, and that field extends outward in many directions at once. There are quarry edges where stone has been taken from the plateau nearby, and there are rising routes where loads move upward by stages. There are open areas where material waits in ordered stacks, workshops where surfaces are trimmed and edges corrected, and spaces where debris is gathered and cleared so that the same path may be used again. The monument in progress is only one part of this landscape. Around it, ordinary work continues in measured task after measured task. The light is strong on limestone. It catches on pale faces of stone and on the dust that softens outlines without hiding them. Across the plateau, movement is practical rather than ceremonial. People go where the ground allows, where loads can pass, where a route has already proven useful. Repeated paths across open ground matter here. A way between quarry and staging area, a way between settlement and oven, a way toward storage, a way back again with jars or cords or tools in hand. Shared labor leaves these routes behind as surely as any mark cut into stone. Royal building in this period gathered many kinds of work together over years. Quarrying belonged to it, and planning and transport and provisioning and maintenance. The visible blocks of a pyramid tell only part of the story. Before and around them there is measuring, carrying, lifting, weighting, clearing, shaping, and setting things in order. There is water brought across dry ground and set down in jars. There is grain moved and ground. There is bread baked in quantity and beer prepared in steady supply. There are onions, fish, and other simple foods that belong not to display but to routine. The stone landscape is tied closely to daily bodily needs, to the regular fact that large groups must eat, drink, rest, and begin again. Archaeological remains from the workers' settlement near Giza show that life beside the monument was organized in practical ways. There were places for baking and brewing, places for keeping supplies, places for administration, and places where groups could sleep close to the work. The settlement and the building ground belong to the same world. One holds ovens, jars, grain, and routine shelter. The other holds loads, routes, stone surfaces, and the repeated motion of crews. Between them, the same feet pass back and forth in dust and sunlight. Nothing here depends on a single dramatic moment. The larger form rises slowly because smaller acts continue steadily. A load is brought forward and then paused. A surface is checked, a path is cleared, a jar is carried, a cord is stretched, a block waits where it has been set down. Someone returns with water, someone else carries bread, another trims stone where a roughness remains. Another keeps account of what has come and gone. Shared labor spreads across the plateau in this quiet way, not as confusion, but as many repeated tasks held together. Even from a distance, the place would not appear still, yet its movement would be measured rather than hurried. A sledge advances in stages. A group gathers around a load and then disperses. Dust lifts briefly at ankle height and settles again. At one edge of the site, stone is cut from the ground that already lies close at hand. At another, material waits its turn. Nearby, a workshop keeps familiar objects in use. Ropes coiled and uncoiled, wooden pieces leaned against stone, copper edges carried away to be renewed, stone pounders resting where they were last set down. These things are present everywhere in outline, as ordinary companions of labor. The plateau itself holds many small sounds without ever becoming sharp. There is scraping at a distance, the dull contact of stone against stone, the soft thud of something set down, the dry movement of sandals over grit, the faint activity of a place where each person belongs to a task. In bright air, these sounds spread thinly. They do not gather into spectacle. They remain part of the background, like the dust on the hands, like sunlight warming pale stone. To understand the place, it helps to notice how much depends on repetition. The same route from one work area to another, the same return to a stack of material, the same carrying of water, the same preparation of food, the same clearing of fragments from a working surface, the same waiting while the next coordinated step becomes possible. Measured task gives shape to the day more than any single achievement. Shared labor gives shape to the place. By degrees, attention settles lower, closer to the things that pass from hand to hand each day. The open ground remains bright and wide, but the eye begins to rest on what is lifted, pulled, sharpened, stretched, guided, and set down again: rope, wood, copper, stone, and the simple tools that keep measured work in motion. Rope comes first, perhaps because it is so often in the hand. Its fibers are rough, dry, and slightly uneven, with places where strain has tightened the twist and places where use has begun to loosen it. Dusk gathers in it, sunlight pales it. It is pulled, looped, knotted, fastened, checked, and drawn taut again. Around large stone, rope is never far away. It helps pull a load, steady a shift, guide a corner, hold a fastening in place. It passes from hand to hand as part of shared labor, and over time it shows that labor plainly, with worn patches, frayed ends, and a softness where many palms have gripped the same length. Near the rope there is wood, smoother in the hand, though marked by pressure and abrasion. A wooden lever does not need to be imagined as a grand device. It can be thought of more quietly, as a practical length of wood used to nudge, raise, or shift a block in small controlled movements. The work of such a tool is patient. A little lift, a little settling, a careful adjustment at the edge of a stone. Wood also belongs to sledges, where runners meet the ground and carry the weight placed upon them. In that meeting of wood and earth, of load and rope, there is a whole world of repeated effort. The sledge does not rush. It moves, pauses, receives another adjustment, and moves again. The stone itself is not all one kind. Much of the core stone at Giza came from quarries close to the plateau, so close that quarry and building ground were part of one connected landscape. The stone face, the cut block, the route of movement, and the rising mass of the monument belonged to the same field of dust and sunlight. Local limestone could be cut, shaped, and brought into place without separating the source from the site by any great distance. Other stone traveled farther. Fine white limestone for the outer casing could come from Tura across the Nile. That brighter stone, smoother and more refined in its finish, linked the dry plateau to river movement beyond it. Its journey can be imagined as another measured task in a larger chain: quarrying in one place, loading in another, transport along water, unloading, staging, and then the familiar handling on land. Granite came from farther still, from Aswan in the south, for some internal chambers and structural elements that required a denser, harder material. Granite enters the scene almost as a change in resistance. It asks more from tools, more from shaping, more from handling, yet even here the mood remains steady. A harder stone does not alter the rhythm so much as deepen it. Copper appears with a different feel. A copper chisel has a brighter edge at first, and then the brightness changes. Use dulls it. Repeated contact with stone rounds what was sharp. The tool remains useful, then less so, then ready for attention again. Copper chisels and saws could serve in quarrying and shaping for certain tasks, but they belonged to a cycle of wear as much as to a moment of cutting. Their edges needed frequent sharpening or reforging, so near the places where stone was cut or dressed, there also had to be the quieter world of maintenance. Metalworkers, tool handlers, and those who renewed worn edges were part of the same practical field as haulers and stone dressers. For tougher surfaces, harder stone tools were useful in their own way. Dolerite pounders, heavy in the hand and heavy again when lifted and brought down, could break and dress stone through repeated impact. Their work is easy to picture because it is so physical and so regular. A pounder is lifted, strikes, is lifted again, and strikes again. Over time, even the pounder changes. Its surface becomes marked by use. Its edges chip and smooth in places. The hand learns its weight. Dust settles over it, and sunlight warms it, just as it warms the block being shaped. Not every useful object cuts or strikes. Some simply carry. Water jars, baskets, and storage containers belong to the same material world. In a dry environment, water is not a detail at the edge of the scene. It is brought, stored, lifted, and set down as part of the background of every measured task. Jars stand in shade when there is shade. They travel along paths already worn by many feet. Baskets hold fragments, tools, or supplies. Pottery breaks, and broken pottery remains underfoot or beside walls, one of the quiet traces of repeated use. The movement of blocks on sledges brings several materials together at once. Wood beneath, rope ahead, stone above, ground below. The load is not only pulled, it is watched, steadied, and corrected. Sometimes the path must be cleared. Sometimes the angle of the block must be adjusted. Sometimes the ground itself asks for attention. There is evidence from images and from practical experiments that wetting the sand in front of a sledge could help reduce drag. It is a modest idea and a sensible one. A little water changes the behavior of the surface. In this way, even sand becomes part of the tool set, not as an object held in the hand, but as a material managed for the sake of movement. Then there are the tools of measure, quieter than pounders and less visible than sledges, but no less central. Measuring cords, plumb bobs, levels, and sighting tools belong to the calm intelligence of the site. A cord stretched straight across a surface is as important as a rope pulling a load. A plumb bob hanging still in warm air gives a line to trust. A level surface does not happen by accident. It is prepared, checked, corrected, and checked again. Careful measurement matters as much as force. The work of surveyors and planners rests on simple objects, but those objects hold the shape of the larger undertaking. A cord, too, wears with use. Fibers tighten and relax. Knots leave memory in the line. Hands learn how much tension is enough. The measuring tool and the hauling rope belong to different tasks, yet both live in the same atmosphere of dust and sunlight, and both depend on repeated handling. One guides a block into place through force, the other guides a surface or angle through precision. Some hands pull, some hands steady. Some hands measure, some hands restore a dulled edge, some hands carry water or bring another tool from storage. The larger work is distributed among these objects and the people who use them. Once these materials are familiar, the day begins to gather around them. A cord is stretched, a sledge is loaded, a tool is checked, a jar is lifted, and the same measured tasks return in their usual order. A cord is stretched across stone that has already felt many cords before. Dust lies in the slight hollows and lifts where feet pass. In the bright air, a load is checked, a rope drawn straight, a wooden runner settled onto the ground. Hands return to familiar objects without much ceremony. The work begins not as one single effort, but as a sequence already known. At a place like Giza, the labor around pyramid building was arranged in groups large enough to matter and small enough to manage. Crews could be divided into smaller teams, and within those teams the same assignments were likely repeated day after day. One set of hands might often pull, another might guide the edge of a load, another might measure, mark, or trim. Another might carry water or clear away broken chips of stone from a work surface. The larger project remains spread out over years, but much of any one day can be understood through a smaller pattern, one measured task returning after another in dust and sunlight. A sledge does not move all at once and then disappear. It advances in a stop-and-start way. Rope grows taut, bodies line. Wood slides over prepared ground, then there is a pause. The path ahead must clear. The load may need to be adjusted. A corner may have shifted slightly and must be steadied. Sand in front of the runners may be dampened. The rope is taken up again. The same movement resumes. This rhythm of pulling and pausing belongs to the day as much as the stone itself. Around such hauling there is waiting, and the waiting is part of the work rather than an interruption to it. A team may stand in sunlight while another load passes. An organizer may direct where the next movement should go. A line may be checked before a block is brought forward. A lever may be set down for a moment and then taken up again. The broad task is continuous, but the body experiences it in intervals: effort, stillness, adjustment, return. Nearby, on surfaces where stone is being prepared, another routine continues with its own steadiness. Measuring cords are drawn tight and lifted again. A plumb line hangs quietly, then is read, then hangs again. Marks are made where trimming is needed. Copper tools bite and scrape for a time, then lose some of their edge. Stone pounders rise and fall with a dull regularity. Chips gather near the feet and are pushed aside. A face of stone becomes flatter, straighter, more even, not in one dramatic moment, but through repeated correction. The tools themselves ask for attention. Copper dulls quickly with use. A bright edge becomes less keen, and the hand that uses it feels the change before the eye sees it clearly. So sharpening and reforging belong inside the same daily rhythm as cutting and shaping. A tool leaves the work for a while, is renewed, and returns. Rope, too, must be watched. Fibers wear under tension. A frayed section is noticed, handled, replaced when needed. Wooden parts smooth where they are gripped again and again. Maintenance is not separate from labor. It is one of the quieter forms of it. Not everyone near the building work is occupied with moving stone. Some carry jars. In a dry place, water has its own steady route through the day. It must be brought, stored, lifted, poured, and brought again. A jar is raised to the shoulder, carried over worn ground, and set down with care. Another is opened, another is sealed. Water belongs to the background of nearly every task, and because it belongs to all of them, it is easy to imagine it moving constantly through the site, from hand to hand, from storage place to work area, under the same dust and sunlight as everything else. Food follows a similar pattern. Bread and beer were staple rations, dependable and practical, suited to large groups and repeated distribution. Grain had to be ground, dough had to be mixed, ovens had to be tended, beer had to be brewed in quantity and portioned out. Alongside bread and beer there were onions, fish, and sometimes meat. Their importance lies in steadiness. They suggest a provisioning system meant to sustain regular effort over time. Even eating belongs to the larger rhythm of measured tasks. Grain arrives, bread is baked, beer is brewed, fish is prepared, portions are given out, the body returns to work. Then the cycle begins again, a route clears, a rope is taken up, a sledge moves a little farther. Elsewhere a stone surface is checked and checked again, a pounder strikes, a copper edge is tested, a jar is lifted, debris is swept from underfoot so that the next action can happen cleanly. Some tasks are heavy, some are careful, some are almost quiet, but all of them fit into the same order. Because the work is organized in crews and smaller teams, repetition can settle into habit. The same people may often work beside one another. The same objects pass between the same hands. A team learns the feel of its rope, the balance of its load, the short pause before movement resumes. Another team learns the patience of measurement, the small correction needed to keep a line true. Another tends the ovens and brewing, where heat, grain, and time must also be managed in regular sequence. Shared labor does not mean that every hand does the same thing. It means that many different routines hold together at once. From the tools already in hand, the ground around them begins to sort itself into places. A hauling path shows itself by use before it is named. A workshop edge becomes known by the small scatter of metalwork and stone dust. An open stretch of pale ground serves as a pause between one effort and the next, where a load can rest for a moment before moving on. In this way, the building site is less a single object than a connected landscape, arranged by repeated crossings in dust and sunlight. The pyramid rises within that larger field, but around it lie other necessary spaces. There are quarry faces nearby, where much of the core stone can be cut close to the plateau itself. There are staging areas where blocks wait in temporary order, not yet in their final place, only set down where the next measured task can find them. There are work surfaces kept as even as possible, where lines are checked, edges are dressed, and chips are cleared away. There are ramps of some kind, essential routes for bringing material upward, though their exact forms may have changed with need, with stage, with the shape of the work at hand. Straight in one place, turning in another, broad enough for passage where passage is required, they belong to the practical geography of the site more than to any single fixed design. Between these places run worn paths. Some are broad and open under full light, their surface bright and dry, with dust lifting under many feet. Others pass close beside walls or stacked materials, where a narrow strip of shade offers a little relief from the hotter open ground. The same route may carry different kinds of movement through the day. A sledge goes one way, empty hands return another. Water jars are brought carefully along a side path. A basket of bread comes from the settlement. A cord, a lever, a fresh tool edge, a note for an overseer, all pass along the same familiar lines. Not far from the building area, the workers' settlement stands in planned relation to it. At Giza, remains from places such as Height El Ghurab show that the world beside the monument was organized with purpose. There were barracks-like galleries, long practical spaces for sleeping and resting. There were storage areas where jars, baskets, grain, and other supplies could be kept in quantity. There were bakeries and breweries, not as occasional additions, but as full parts of the same system. There were places for administration as well, where attendance, rations, deliveries, and crew arrangements could be handled in regular order. The nearness matters. Ordinary life and large construction stood side by side. The crossing from settlement to work area was part of the structure of the day. A person might leave the galleries and step out into the dry brightness of morning, pass a bakery where grain has already been ground and dough shaped, move by storage rooms where jars stand in rows, and then continue onto the open plateau where stone waits, ropes lie coiled, and the first load is being prepared. The baker, the hauler, the stone dresser, the scribe, the water carrier, and the tool maintainer all move within one connected arrangement of rooms, yards, thresholds, and paths. The bakeries and breweries add their own warmth to the settlement edge. Ovens hold heat even when the open air is still cool by comparison. Grain is brought in, ground, mixed, baked, and portioned in steady quantity. Beer, too, belongs to this regular production, a staple provision made near at hand so that distribution can remain dependable. Nearby there may be onions, fish, and other foods in storage or preparation, practical additions to a rationing system built for sustained work rather than display. Baskets and jars gather in these areas. Dust settles on thresholds and is brushed aside. The movement from oven to storage, from storage to distribution, is as much a part of the monument's world as the movement of stone. Water leaves its own map across the site. In a dry environment, water must be brought, stored, and carried with care. Jars stand in shaded places where they can be reached again and again. Vessels are lifted, set down, lifted again. A supply point becomes familiar because so many hands return to it. Along one path, the marks are left by feet carrying weight steadily. Along another, the ground is disturbed by repeated setting down of containers before they are taken onward to crews working in the open. Water belongs to the ordinary architecture here, as necessary as rope or grain. Workshops occupy another edge of this landscape. They need not be large to be important. A place where copper is sharpened or reforged, where worn edges are renewed, where a wooden part is adjusted, where rope is inspected and replaced, becomes one of the quiet centers of continuity. Tools do not remain useful by themselves. They return to these stations, and from these stations they return to the hands that need them. A stone pounder rests near the place where shaping is done. Measuring cords are kept in order, plumb bobs and levels ready to be carried back onto prepared surfaces. Administrative spaces are quieter, though no less practical. Here the work is counted rather than hauled. Deliveries are noted, rations are tracked, crews and smaller teams can be kept in order through names, portions, and assignments. The broad site becomes manageable through such regular attention. In one place stone is trimmed, in another place bread is divided. In another, a record is made that these things have passed from storage to crew, from arrival to use. Even this is part of the worn path between one station and another. Out on the plateau, the open areas remain bright and spare. Temporary stacks of stone stand in useful relation to ramps or working surfaces. A route clears, then fills, then clears again. Some teams wait while another load passes. Some pause to adjust rope, to settle a block more evenly on a sledge, to receive a brief instruction before continuing. The space itself helps shape the rhythm. Wide ground allows a turn. A narrow approach slows movement. Shade beside a wall becomes a place of short rest before returning to heat in open ground. No single point explains the whole site. It is the relation between points that matters. The route is familiar now because it has already been taken many times. A cord is drawn tight again. A sledge is steadied again. A hand closes around rope, wood, or stone in a grip learned through use rather than thought. The day does not need to announce itself in any special way. It continues where the last one left off, with the same measured task waiting in dust and sunlight. On one morning the light is pale and low, and the ground still holds a little coolness before the heat settles over it. On another, brightness arrives quickly, laying a harder shine across stone surfaces and making every grain of dust visible where feet have passed. Later, when the light softens, the same path appears gentler, though it remains the same path underfoot, marked by repeated movement. In this way time passes at the site, not by sudden change, but by the return of familiar work under slightly altered light. The same teams come back to the same kinds of labor. One set of hands helps guide a load, another checks a line, another trims a surface that is nearly right and must be made a little more even, another clears away fragments left by shaping stone, another carries water in jars, setting them down where they will be needed and lifting them again when they are not. The monument grows slowly, but the day is filled less by the idea of growth than by the next small action that fits into the one before it. Much of the work moves in a stop-and-start rhythm. A load begins to move, then pauses. Rope is adjusted, the block settles more evenly, a path must clear. Then the pull begins again and the sledge slides forward over prepared ground. Sand may be dampened ahead of it enough to ease the drag. Then another pause comes, not as interruption, but as part of the work itself. Waiting belongs to the routine as surely as hauling. So does returning for the next load after the first has been set down. Because the same actions are repeated, tools become familiar not only by sight but by touch. A wooden lever has a smooth place where many hands have held it. Rope fibers roughen the palm in a way that is expected. A stone pounder carries its weight in a known manner from one day to the next. Measuring cords are stretched, gathered, and stretched again. Plumb lines hang still for a moment, then are lifted and used elsewhere. Surfaces are checked, then checked again, because a measured task often asks for return rather than completion in a single attempt. Copper edges tell time in their own quiet way. A chisel begins with a clearer edge, then loses it little by little against stone. It is taken aside, sharpened, renewed, and brought back into the round of work, where is not separate from labor. It is one of the forms labor takes. The edge softens, is restored, and softens again. Days pass through that cycle as steadily as they pass through hauling and measuring. The ground also keeps a record, though a modest one. Dust gathers in the same corners and is stirred again by feet. Footprints cross and recross a work surface until they blur into one another. Chipped stone collects in small drifts before being swept or carried away. Broken pottery appears here and there where jars have been used, emptied, lifted, or dropped over time. Frayed rope fibers remain after a length has worn too thin for further trust. None of these things asks for attention. They simply accumulate, quiet evidence that the same hands have returned and returned again. Even rest has a repeated shape. Bread is divided as it was divided before. Beer is carried and received in ordinary portions. Onions, fish, and sometimes meat enter the routine not as celebration, but as part of steady provisioning for bodies that will do the same work tomorrow. Eating and drinking do not stand apart from the labor around them. They belong to the same cycle of return, as regular as sharpening a tool or clearing a path. Beyond these repeated days, the plateau does not stand alone. The dry ground above and the Nile below belong to one working landscape, joined by ordinary routes and by habits of movement so familiar that they would have seemed almost as fixed as the stone itself. Dust and sunlight lie over the higher ground. Below, the river offers another surface, quieter and more yielding, carrying loads that the plateau cannot produce on its own. Between river and plateau, paths are worn by feet and by crews guiding supplies upward in stages. What appears from a distance as one monument rests within this wider pattern of connection. Much of the core stone could be taken from the plateau itself or from nearby ground, keeping one part of the labor local and steady. Yet other materials arrived by more extended routes. Fine white limestone for outer casing could come from Tura across the Nile. Granite used for some interior spaces came from Aswan far to the south, moving along the river through a longer sequence of loading, travel, unloading, and placement. So the building site gathered materials of different origins into one field of measured task. Some stone was near, some crossed the river, some came from much farther away. All of it entered shared labor in the end. The Nile made this possible without needing to become a grand presence. It was a route, a calendar, and a practical companion to the dry plateau. Its annual cycle affected how people and goods moved. When the flood season changed the relation between land and water, transport could become more convenient in some ways, while the rhythms of farming shifted as well. Labor available for royal work and the movement of supplies were both shaped by these larger seasonal patterns. Grain, stone, fuel, pottery, rope, and people all belonged to a world that adjusted itself to the river's return. From the river's edge, supplies did not simply appear at the building ground. They passed through hands, containers, records, and storage. Water in particular mattered in a place of dry air and open light. It had to be brought, stored, and distributed, becoming part of the background of every day. One can picture rows of vessels in shade, dampness cooling the clay, and then the slow reduction of those stores as water moved outward into cooking, brewing, mixing, washing, and drinking. Even where stone dominates the eye, jars and baskets are never far away. The same is true of grain. Bread and beer, the ordinary staples of Egyptian labor, required their own steady industry. Near the workers' settlement, bakeries and breweries formed a second landscape beside the stone one, full of grinding, mixing, heating, fermenting, and portioning. Grain became flour, dough, loaves, mash, drink. The process was repetitive and practical, another measured task carried out nearer ovens, bins, and work tables than quarry edges. Bread and beer could be produced in quantity, and that quantity mattered. It allowed crews to return to the same labor day after day without the food system needing to begin anew each morning. Other foods entered the same network. Evidence from workers' areas points to onions, fish, and meat as part of regular provisioning. Animal bones from these settlements suggest organized delivery and butchery of cattle, sheep, and goats, not isolated chance meals, but a supply system with routine behind it. A ration in the hand of one worker had already passed through fields, boats, storerooms, and kitchens before reaching the plateau. This wider world included many kinds of workers whose tasks were less visible from a distance than hauling stone, though no less necessary. Bakers and brewers worked near heat and grain. Cooks prepared food in quantity. Potters made and replaced vessels that cracked, chipped, and wore out. Boat crews handled transport along the Nile. Animal handlers managed the movement and care of livestock. Stone dressers refined surfaces. Tool maintainers kept worn edges useful. Scribes and overseers turned movement into record and record back into order. Shared labor spread outward in all directions, from the quarry face to the bakery, from the river landing to the sleeping gallery. The remains at Height El Ghurab help make this world easier to imagine. They are close to the building zone. Archaeology has shown planned areas for sleeping, storage, food processing, and administration. Barracks-like galleries, bakeries, breweries, and storerooms suggest not a loose crowd gathered by chance, but an organized settlement arranged to support repeated work. The monument and the settlement stood beside one another as parts of the same undertaking. One held the visible rise of stone, the other held the daily means by which that rise could continue. Within such a system, named crews and smaller teams fit naturally. A large project becomes manageable when divided into groups that can be counted, supplied, and assigned. Rations, attendance, deliveries, and progress could be noted in manageable portions. A boatload of limestone, a store of grain, a tally of jars, a list of workers present, a portion of bread and beer set aside for one crew rather than another. All of this belongs to the same measured task. Administration here is not separate from labor. It is another form of carrying, another way of moving weight from one place to the next, though the weight is counted in numbers, names, and portions. A path hardens under many feet. At the edge of a doorway, stone grows smoother where sandals passed over it day after day. A work surface gathers its own quiet record, pale dust in corners, chipped fragments near the hand, a shallow scrape where a tool was set down and lifted again. In dust and sunlight, repeated motion leaves a light impression at first, then a steadier one. Time does not always announce itself in large changes. Sometimes it settles into worn surfaces. Around the pyramid ground, the great mass of stone would rise slowly, but the smaller signs of work gathered more quickly. A block might keep the marks of shaping on one face, faint lines and shallow grooves where hands, tools, and ground met again and again. Nearby, a patch of earth could hold broken pottery, not from one single moment, but from many ordinary uses. A jar carried water, grain, or beer, then cracked, then left a rim or handle in the dust. Rope fibers frayed where strain returned each day. Copper edges dulled, were sharpened, dulled again, and in that cycle of use and renewal there was another kind of trace, less visible now, but still present in the pattern of maintenance that surrounded the work. The workers' settlement near Giza preserves this quieter side especially well. Planned spaces stood close to the building area. Walls still suggest order. Barracks-like galleries speak of sleeping places arranged in rows. Storage areas remain as evidence of things gathered and portioned. Food processing spaces show where grain was handled, where dough was made, where drink was prepared in quantity. Bakeries and breweries stood beside the royal project as part of the same shared labor. The monument and the ovens belonged to one world. In such a place, measured task did not end when stone stopped moving for a while. It continued in grinding grain, carrying jars, tending heat, clearing ash, stacking supplies, and keeping count. An oven leaves a different trace from a quarry face, yet both belong to repeated labor. One keeps the memory of warmth and bread, the other keeps the memory of striking, trimming, levering, and dragging. Sunlight crosses both. Dust settles over both. The same long habit of return shaped them. Animal bone remains among the small material survivals as well. Cattle, sheep, and goats were part of an organized food system that supported sustained work. Bones left after butchery and cooking are quiet evidence of provisioning carried out steadily. They suggest delivery, division, preparation, and use. Bread and beer form the daily base, but onions, fish, and meat also belong to the wider rhythm of nourishment. Pottery fragments do the same. A scatter of sherds may seem modest beside a pyramid, but jars and bowls were among the most handled objects on the site. They held water in a dry place. They carried grain, beer, and prepared food. They stood in storage, traveled short distances, were lifted, emptied, washed, used again, then broken. Their remains gather near bakeries, breweries, work areas, and living spaces, tying the whole landscape together through ordinary use. Administrative order leaves traces too, even when the writing itself survives only in part. Work was divided, tracked, and returned to. Rations had to match groups. Attendance had to be known. Deliveries had to arrive in some relation to need. Progress had to be observed in manageable portions. Organization remains in the shape of settlement spaces, in the logic of storage, in the repeated pairing of labor and ration, route, and destination. The ground itself keeps some of the gentlest evidence. Repeated paths between sleeping quarters, ovens, storage rooms, workshops, and the building area become practical lines worn into daily life. They are not ceremonial lines, they are useful ones. A person carrying water takes the same way as before. A team returning from a hauling task passes the same corner wall. Someone bringing bread to a work group follows a familiar route in dust and sunlight. Over months and years, these movements smooth thresholds, mark surfaces, and leave accumulations of small debris that say more about real time than any single impressive moment. From the long return of the same days, attention settles on what those days left behind. Not only the high stone, not only the broad form that still gathers light, but the smaller things near the ground, a blunted edge, a cracked jar rim, a bakery floor darkened by use. Dust gathered in the corners of places where hands once moved steadily from one measured task to another. Walls and rooms and long gallery-like spaces suggest ordered living close to ordered labor. The building zone and the settlement were not far apart in meaning, even when they were separated by paths and open ground. One place held stone and hauling. Another held sleep, storage, grinding, baking, brewing, counting. Together they formed one field of shared labor under dust and sunlight. The galleries, barracks-like in their arrangement, speak softly of repeated use. Thresholds wear down little by little. Floors receive the same feat over and over. Nearby, spaces for food processing and storage show that ordinary life stood beside the royal project without needing ceremony to make it real. Grain had to be brought, ground, mixed, baked. Beer had to be prepared in quantity. Jars had to be filled, moved, emptied, set aside. In the end, many of these acts remain visible not as events but as residue. Fragments of pottery, ash, the outline of ovens, storerooms that once held what a crew would need before returning to the open brightness of the worksite. Bread and beer, so plain in mention, become substantial when seen through their traces. Large-scale baking and brewing leave behind more than the memory of meals. They leave installations, vessels, waste, and patterns of repeated handling. They show that provisioning was not separate from construction but part of the same system. A loaf and a stone block belonged to the same day. Grain ground in shade and a sledge pulled in sunlight were linked by the same practical order. Toolware also remains. Copper edges dulled quickly in use and had to be sharpened again and again. Even when the tools themselves are gone or survive only in part, the fact of wear stays near the surface of the site. Stone pounders bear the marks of repeated striking. Wooden equipment would have smoothed where hands gripped it most often, worn where weight pressed and shifted. Rope frayed, fibers breaking little by little under strain, then replaced and used again. These are not grand remains, yet they are faithful ones. They keep close to the truth that much of the work was maintenance, correction, renewal. The same can be said of the ground itself. Dust and chipped stone collect in ways that belong to habit rather than occasion. Broken pottery settles into the soil. Worn paths form between one useful place and another. A work surface, once leveled with care, keeps the faint memory of measured task even after the task has passed. Planned storage areas, repeated routes, traces of administration, all suggest that the monument in progress was also a place of counting and placing, of keeping things where they could be found again. What survives, then, is not only architecture but use, not only walls but the wear on walls, not only rooms but the repeated movement that gave those rooms their shape in daily life. A brewery or bakery ruin may seem humble beside the pyramid, yet it carries its own steadiness. It says that heat was tended there, that grain was transformed there, that portions were prepared there for bodies engaged in hauling, trimming, carrying, clearing. The support systems do not stand outside the work, they are the work seen from another angle. As these traces grow quieter, the larger site begins to soften into fewer elements. Rope once drawn taut, wood once worn smooth, stone marked by use, dust lifting and settling in sunlight. The old world narrows gently toward these simple materials, still holding the rhythm that passed through them again and again. A cord is drawn straight across pale ground, and for a moment that is enough. A line held, a surface checked, a measured task returning in the same calm form it had taken before. Near it, rope tightens along the front of a wooden sledge, fibers pressed together. Wood bears weight, stone waits, then shifts a little. Dust lifts in sunlight and settles again. The motions do not need to be many. Pulling, then pausing, steadying, then easing, lifting a jar, lowering it, setting a loaf down, dividing it, raising a copper edge to stone again so that use may continue. The older world, when it grows dimmer, rests in these repeated contacts, hand to rope, rope to wood, wood to stone, foot to ground already worn by other feet. A sledge moves in short progress, not continuously but by stages. The rope draws taut, the load comes forward, and then there is a brief stillness while the path clears, while the weight settles into its new place, while hands adjust what has shifted. Nothing in this rhythm is sudden. The work advances through return. Another pull follows the pause, and after that another pause, all under the same dry brightness, with dust and sunlight keeping close to every surface. Elsewhere, a wooden lever takes strain and then releases it. A stone pounder rises and falls in the old practical way. A copper tool, bright at first and then less bright, meets resistance until its edge grows dull. That dullness is not an ending. It belongs to the cycle as surely as the cutting did. The edge is sharpened, returned to the hand, and used again. Wear and renewal lie beside one another so quietly that they almost seem the same motion seen at different moments. The places between tasks matter too. Waiting near a load, standing with a cord in hand until it is needed, holding a jar against the hip before carrying it on, looking down at a surface where chips of stone have gathered and where footprints cross one another in fine dust. A measured task often includes its own stillness. The line must be kept true, the load must be guided, not hurried, the path must open. Shared labor is made not only of movement, but of these small pauses that let movement continue. Bread appears in the same softened way, not as a feast, only as portion and repetition. Loaves set down, pieces divided, beer in jars carried and placed where hands can reach it, onions, fish, sometimes meat, all entering the day as sustenance rather than event. Water too, always needing to be lifted, carried, stored, and poured in a dry place where the body and the work both require it. A jar rises, a jar lowers, the rounded weight passing from one set of hands to another. Pottery rims wear smooth where they are often touched. The distinction between one area and the next begins to blur. Workshop, path, ramp, bakery, settlement, quarry edge, all soften into one continuous field of repeated motion. Routes connect them, but so does habit. Rope is handled in more than one place. Dust settles on every threshold. Bread is carried across the same ground where stone chips lie. A tool sharpened in one corner returns to use in another. The whole working world is joined by contact and recurrence, by surfaces worn through handling, and by sunlight moving over them without changing their purpose. Even the larger stone mass recedes. What remains nearest is not the finished form but the work at its edges. A cord stretched and lifted away, a lever placed beneath weight, a sledge runner passing over ground, a copper edge renewed, a jar set down beside another jar. Repetition becomes the clearest fact. Months and years can almost be felt inside it, not as separate spans, but as the long continuation of the same few actions carried out with care. And around those actions gather the small remains of use, chipped stone, broken pottery, worn rope fibers, tool edges softened by labor, footprints pressed into dust and then crossed by later feet. These are quiet accumulations. They do not ask to be arranged into a grand view. They simply rest where repeated motion left them, under dust and sunlight, among wood and stone. A rope lies slack now where it had once been drawn tight. Its fibers are rough, a little opened by use, holding the memory of strain in a quiet way. Nearby, a copper edge has lost its brightness. It no longer meets stone. It rests among other things that have also been handled often and then set down, wood smoothed by the palm, a jar with dust at its rim, a fragment of chipped rock, a basket no longer being lifted. The old working world remains close in these objects. It stays in what has been worn, carried, sharpened, measured, and used again. The pale surfaces still hold the day's light, though more softly now. Dust and sunlight have been companions here for a very long time. They settle over stone, over paths, over thresholds, over the edges of work spaces where many small tasks once met each other. A measured task leaves only a slight mark when seen alone, a line checked with cord, a block trimmed at one corner, a tool renewed, a load guided into place. But in repetition, these slight things gather. They shape the ground as surely as heavier work does. The monument remains broad and still, but around it lingers the quieter arrangement that made it possible. Not only stone set upon stone, but bread prepared in quantity, water brought and stored, grain ground, jars filled, ropes inspected, wooden gear repaired, copper sharpened and sharpened again. The bakeries and breweries near the workers' settlement belong to the same world as the quarry face and the staging ground. A loaf, a cup of beer, an onion, a fish, portions of meat from an organized supply of animals, all these were part of the same practical order as sledges, levers, and measuring cords. In the settlement areas near Giza, the remains of ordinary arrangement still speak in a low voice. Galleries where people slept, spaces for baking and brewing, storage rooms, work areas, surfaces crossed many times, thresholds worn by passage. The site was never only a single rising form of masonry. It was also a neighborhood of repeated movement, where one route led from sleeping place to oven, another from workshop to ramp, another from quarry edge to stack of stone. Worn paths joined these places more faithfully than ceremony did. Dust gathered in them, and feet returned and returned again. The crews and smaller teams that worked here likely knew their own repeated tasks well. One group hauling, another trimming, another carrying water, another keeping account of rations and deliveries, another tending tools whose edges never stayed sharp for long. The system was large, but much of life within it must have felt narrow and familiar, shaped by the same assignment met each day. Even the tools suggest repetition more than event. Copper dulls, it is sharpened, it dulls again. Wood bears pressure and then is set aside. Rope rubs against hands, runners, and loads until it begins to fray. A measured task asks for these materials again and again. They answer in wear. Their quiet record is not dramatic. It is enough that they were there and that they were used often. The broad ground keeps this kind of memory well. Dust settles into shallow footprints on work surfaces. Sunlight passes over small grooves in stone where cutting or smoothing once took place. A cracked jar rim remains where water or grain was once held. A blunted edge suggests maintenance as much as making. The practical landscape of ramps, routes, workshops, and storage places has softened but not disappeared. Its order can still be felt in the arrangement of remains, in how one useful area lies near another, in how the ordinary needs of labor were placed within reach. So what lasts is not only the great mass of stone, it is also the evidence of the world around it, modest and material, bread and water, rope and wood, copper and chipped limestone, galleries, bakeries, breweries and stores, dusting corners, footprints under later dust, tools set down after use. The monument outlasts the day, but the day has not vanished entirely. It stays in marks, wear, and placement. It stays in the memory of measured task and shared labor, held quietly by pale stone under fading light. There is no need for further movement. Stone keeps its old marks. Dust settles into the same corners. The broad ground grows still around rope, wood, jars, and pale limestone, around paths worn by many feet and thresholds smoothed by passing. The old work remains in small things now, in surfaces that remember touch, in places that once held bread, water, tools, and rest. And the light, growing softer on the plateau, lies gently over all of it, until even the marks of labor seem to rest.